This is the last year for our Barley Max trials. These trials were developed by Mitch Japp from Sask Barley, and they're being led by us through ECRF and Parkland College. The second trial in this project was designed to determine if the optimum rate of nitrogen for newer and higher yielding malt barley varieties like Synergy or Bow differs from older industry standards like Metcalfe. Trial locations in 2020 and 2021 were Yorkton, Melfort, Prince Albert, and Swift Current.
Have you ever noticed that high-yielding wheat varieties tend to have lower grain protein? While this is not desirable for hard red spring varieties destined for the human consumption market, it is desirable for grains destined for alcohol production, like ethanol wheat or malt barley. Less protein means more starch to turn into alcohol. Some of the newer malt barley varieties are much higher yielding than the old standby AC Metcalfe. This made us wonder if high-yielding varieties of malt barley had lower grain protein than AC Metcalfe, and if so, would the most economic rate of nitrogen be higher for these varieties? To present the results of the study, I felt it was best to split the trials into high and low-yielding groups. There are 7 site years in the high-yielding group and 5 in the low-yielding group. The low-yielding site years were the result of drought, which resulted in grain yields that were unresponsive to added nitrogen and grain protein levels that were too high for malt. Yield and grain protein from the low-yielding site years averaged 40 bushels per acre and 15%. In contrast, the high-yielding site years averaged 92 bushels per acre of grain with a lower protein content of 12%. High protein is not desired by maltsters, and for the sake of argument, I will assume grain protein above 12.5% in this study is not suitable for malt. These are the main effects of barley variety on yield for the high-yielding site years and the low-yielding sites. On average, Synergy was the highest-yielding variety, followed by Bow and then Metcalfe, for both groups. However, Bow did not yield statistically more than Metcalfe when yield potential was low. In both cases, grain protein for Metcalfe was higher, which makes sense as it typically has a lower yield potential. These varietal rankings were fairly consistent between site years, but there were a few exceptions. For example, yields did not statistically differ between varieties in Prince Albert in 2021, despite it being a high-yielding site. Here's the effect of increasing nitrogen on barley yield for the low-yielding site years. Note the scale is soil plus fertilizer N, so the yield response to added nitrogen is not starting until 78 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is the average level of N in the top 2 feet of soil. Yield response to increasing nitrogen are represented by the blue line for AC Metcalfe, orange line for Synergy, and gray line for Bow. Clearly, none of the varieties are particularly responsive to added nitrogen for the low-yielding site years. In contrast, the protein was increasing sharply with added nitrogen for all varieties. The levels of protein are much higher for Metcalfe compared to the other varieties, but regardless of variety, all protein levels are well above 13%, even when no nitrogen was applied. None of the varieties are likely to make malt based on protein, but CDC Bow and AAC Synergy have a better chance. The information here implies that Metcalfe should be fertilized with less nitrogen than the other varieties. But let's see how things shake out for the high-yielding group. Here are the yield responses to added nitrogen for the high-yielding site years. Soil nitrogen reserves for these sites averaged 82 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is just a touch higher than the 78 pounds of nitrogen per acre for the low-yielding group. You can see Metcalfe in blue is lower yielding than the other varieties, and is hitting a yield plateau at a lower level of soil plus fertilizer nitrogen. This alone implies that Metcalfe will require less nitrogen to maximize yield, but we still need to look at the grain protein. Again, Metcalfe in blue has a higher grain protein than the other varieties. Assuming barley grain with a protein greater than 12.5% won't make malt, then less nitrogen needs to be applied to Metcalfe than the other varieties. For simplicity's sake, let's remove Bow and just compare Metcalfe with Synergy. For Metcalfe, 12.5% grain protein was reached at 164 pounds of soil plus fertilizer nitrogen. In contrast, 12.5% grain protein for Synergy in orange was not reached until 208 pounds of soil plus fertilizer N. That's a huge difference of 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Let's go back to the yield responses for Metcalfe and Synergy. At the rate of nitrogen that results in 12.5% protein for Metcalfe, Metcalfe yielded 97 bushels per acre and Synergy yielded 106 bushels per acre. But we can still push the rate of nitrogen for Synergy another 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre before we reach 12.5% protein. This also provided us with another 4 bushels per acre for Synergy. But should we be pushing nitrogen rates this far, and should we be applying 144 pounds of nitrogen more to Synergy relative to Metcalfe? Well, let's apply some economics to these response curves. If we go back to the 2021 crop planning guide when economics were brighter, nitrogen only cost 47 cents per pound, and malt barley was $5.20 per bushel. With these assumptions, the most economic rate of soil plus fertilizer N was 164 pounds per acre for Metcalfe and 194 pounds per acre for Synergy. With these economics, Synergy only requires 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre more and not the extra 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre it could be fertilized with before exceeding 12.5% protein. However, this is still a big difference. One of the reasons it's so large is we can't increase the level of soil plus fertilizer N above 164 pounds per acre without increasing grain protein beyond 12.5% for Metcalfe. At 164 pounds of nitrogen per acre for Metcalfe, one additional dollar spent on nitrogen is returning $1.09 in malt. In contrast, at 194 pounds of nitrogen for Synergy, grain protein is still below 12.5%, and $1 spent on nitrogen is returning $1 worth of grain. Perhaps a fair comparison between varieties would be to compare them both at $1 of nitrogen providing $1.09 of grain. If we do this, the most economic level of nitrogen for Synergy has dropped to 186 pounds per acre. Now the difference in optimum N between the varieties is only 22 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But wait! I can drop the difference even more if I use the poorer economic scenario from the 2023 crop planning guide of $1.18 per pound of nitrogen and $6.76 per bushel of malt. In this case, the most economic rates of soil plus fertilizer N are pushed down to 144 pounds per acre for Metcalfe and 156 pounds per acre for Synergy. This is only a difference of 12 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and this is when the last dollar you spent on nitrogen generates $1 of grain. If you want your last dollar spent on nitrogen to produce $1.10 of grain, then this shifts the optimum rates down the curve, and now Synergy only requires 9 pounds per acre of more nitrogen. You see, the lower we go down these response curves, the more similar is the response between varieties. So this table sort of summarizes everything we've just discussed. The left-hand column sort of represents your level of risk. Do you want the last dollar you spent on nitrogen to generate $1 in grain, or do you want it to generate $1.10 in grain? And then we have the middle column, which is showing you the additional N requirement for Synergy over Metcalfe based on a poorer economic scenario, and the right-hand column shows it under a better economic scenario. So we know that under high-yielding conditions, Synergy could be fertilized with up to 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre more than AC Metcalfe before exceeding 12.5% protein. But doing so would be risky and uneconomical. But it does show there's more wiggle room with Synergy to increase nitrogen rates. Under good economic conditions, Synergy could receive somewhere between 21 and 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre more than Metcalfe, depending upon your risk tolerance. It's whether you want your last dollar spent on nitrogen providing $1.10 or $1 of grain. 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre is probably a good place to experiment with if you want to try this. Under poorer economic conditions, Synergy would only benefit from 9 to 12 pounds of nitrogen per acre more than AC Metcalfe. So, 10 pounds per acre sounds like a good place to start. So I'd like to point out that all of this has assumed the price received for Synergy and Metcalfe is going to be the same. And I'd also like to point out that I don't suspect optimum rates of nitrogen are going to vary much between newer malt barley varieties, as their yield and protein response to added nitrogen are going to be much more similar. Well, that's it for this study. After 3 years, the project is done. Again, I'd like to thank Mitch Japp with Sask Barley and Shannon Chant with the provincial government for developing this project and the support that was provided by the Strategic Field Program.